can open up the screens for me, it does help me feel like I'm not talking to myself and helps for the engagement. We started recording, so that's done. Um, I'm gonna jump into my notes for the speech for the reading, and then we'll move into our fishbowl, and then we'll move into our classroom conversation, and then we'll call that a day. Um, is there any questions you guys want me to address before I go into my notes? All right, so I'll just get into it. So we know that this is, as I mentioned, Dr. King's last speech. The speech is titled "I've Been to the Mountaintop," and if you think about the end of the speech, you can understand why. Um, so a couple of things that I thought were of interest, or were poignant. One, he mentions that unity amongst the enslaved will end the institution of enslavement, right? And he says that one of the tools that the master, and it's in reference to the slave master, and he's talking about the Pharaoh in Egypt in this context, one of the tools that they used was to keep those who were enslaved divided, right? And he argues that once those who are enslaved could come together, they could eliminate eternally this institution of enslavement. Um, he also talks about the human rights issues facing all people of color throughout the world, and he calls that the human rights revolution, right? And that's the term that he gives for addressing these human rights. So you even hear in Martin Luther King a shift from civil rights focus to a more broader human rights focus, okay? Um, you also see that towards the end of King's career, to the latter stages of his life, there's also an evolution of focusing on just the civil rights to developing more of a class analysis. And you see him working with the poor people's movement, and you see him working for workers' unions, in this case, the sanitation workers' union. Um, and then he also claims for the United States to live up to what they claim to say that they're about, right? So you hear a moral and an ethical critique of the United States. Um, he also talks about, and this is kind of similar to Malcolm, the intersection of religion and politics. And he says that preachers should have a moral obligation to be involved in the political struggles, to be involved in the human rights struggles, to be involved in the civil rights struggles. And he calls out preachers who he deems as self-serving, right? Who are just there to be self-grandizing and not really want to take their mission beyond the church pews. Um, Again, as I mentioned, the focus on the poor people's movement, that's a shift that he has in his later stages of his career. He also talks about Black economic empowerment, right? And he talks about using a financial boycott. So when you think back to what you hear and what you learn about King, you talk about the Montgomery bus boycotts and things of that nature. But what you don't hear often about King is how he uses the economic power base of Black folks to boycott in that fashion as well. And in the speech that we heard for this week, you hear him talking about boycotting Coca-Cola, right? Um, and then finally, for me, is just to me listening to the speech, especially towards the latter stage of the speech, you hear an urgency in King, right? And I think if we think about it being his last speech, right, you can hear why there's that urgency there. That's the impending doom that he felt that was fastly approaching him. Um, but then it also speaks to his courage, right? Because although he knew that his life would be cut short, which he says in his speech, he continues on with his mission, right? So those are the things that I found of interest. We'll open it up to the fishbowl. Realistically, if you have not done your two fish bowls, this is the time to do it. We probably won't do a fishbowl next week with the guest speaker. There will be participation opportunities that could serve as your fishbowl, but this will probably be our last official day to fishbowl. So if you think you're short, you may want to jump on that. Are there any volunteers for our fishbowl?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, got you, Kaylin. And remember, for your fishbowl, you could talk about what was mentioned right now in my brief lecture. You could talk about what was discussed in the breakout groups, or anything that you found of interest in your journals, or just period, with the reading or the speech. Is there anyone else who wants to volunteer? All right. So I'll just call
I'll
that.
volunteer.
Okay,
Oh,
gotcha.
I was just gonna say I'll volunteer, but if there's someone that needs to fishbowl because they haven't, I'm good with that too.
Okay. Well, I'll put you down, and then what we can do is
Okay.
open it up beyond three if there's people who have not fishbowl. Is there
Okay.
anyone else who wants to volunteer? All right, so I'll call for one more, and then that will make up the three for a fishbowl. Galilee, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
I think I fishbowl twice already.
No worries. If you did already, then nothing to worry about. Alex, are you prepared to fishbowl today, or have you done two already for the semester?
Yeah, I've done two for the semester.
Perfect. Jack, how about you, man? Have you done two fish bowls for the semester, and if not, are you prepared to go today?
Yeah, I did too this semester.
No worries. Nakai, have you done your two fish bowls for the semester?
No, I haven't, but I'll go today.
Okay. All right. You'll be the last one then. So I'll shut up, and whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I can start. Um, when I was reading and listening to the speech, but there was a part that I was looking at. It said, "We are poor. Never stop and forget that collectively, that means all of us together. Collectively, we are richer than all the nations in the world, and except for nine of them." And I was thinking about how they basically was saying that individually we're poor, individually that we don't have a lot of power, but together we have power and we're rich. And I was thinking about how um one of the things he was talking about was the way to basically stop slavery is to come together and stuff like that. But as we see now and have been seeing throughout history, we always have some type of division, whether it's religion, politics, something that divides us. They even had us argue about colorism, like the skin of our color, the color of our skin. And I was thinking about how there was a point in time where we could have came together and talk and have discussions about it, but now it's not like that. But I've I felt like um there might not ever be a point in time where we can actually have that conversation. So I was like, when I was listening to it, it sounded like it was so hopeful. It was so like, if we do this then this will happen. But now that I'm living through living in the times, and I can see the history, it's kind of like it's repeating itself. So that's something that I observed.
Good observations, Caitlin. Who's next?
I'll go ahead and share it. So for me, I wanted to share like the differences that I noted between Malcolm X and Dr. King, like the differences between their speech and also the delivery of their speech. I noticed like one of the big differences is that Dr. King, he did actually incorporate like religion into his speech. For him, like, well, of course he's a preacher, and he did like incorporate that a lot, and he did speak of God and like his mission, especially like in the beginning when he was stating, like if God asked him what like point in time would he like to live in, and then he kind of just went through everything and explained his reasons and everything. And I noticed that with Malcolm X, he did like state, like what are his beliefs and his religion, but he kind of just like he kind of like kept that like out of his speech. And so that was one of the like major differences that I noted. And then also, of course, just kind of like the way that they delivered their speech, where Dr. King, he kind of like took more pauses throughout the speech. But so obviously that also like it creates an impact on like on what he's saying, and also on the audience, of course. And I also just noted how even though they may be like different, they're both fighting for the same thing, which in the end it's freedom. You know, even though like I know Malcolm X, he thought, well, he supported more like, you know, ideas of separation, where Dr. King, he believed that, you know, they should all be united as a community to get to freedom, but at the end they both had the same goal, and you know, even though they're different, like they were both fighting for the same thing.
Thank you, Natalia. Good point. Nakai, it's on you, man.
And so I would like to mention the differences between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So starting with Malcolm X, so religion. So we mentioned like religion during his speech. He said like he encourages the people to like keep their religions in their homes and in their closets instead of like spreading religion to others, because you know many people were divided by their religious experience from communicating with others and stuff. And on the other side with Martin Luther King, I mean, um, so yeah, he has lots of experiences with Christian religion. We all know he's a preacher in Atlanta, Georgia, and stuff. He likes sometimes he likes like use religion to like bring people together instead of like you know dividing people and stuff. So yeah, all about religion.
One thing that Nakai brings up, he brings up the spatial reality, right? So he says that, I'll put you on mute, Nakai. Stop the feedback. He says that, you know, Martin Luther King was in Atlanta, right? And he uses religion to help galvanize the people, right? And I'm going to kind of tie this to what Natalia says, because she says, you know, in Martin Luther King's speech, it's a slower pace to it. He uses those pauses, right? And I think if you string those two comments together, that's why you hear those pauses, right? One, I don't know if anybody's been down south, but the pace of things down south is very slow. So I spent a semester in Jackson, Tennessee. It's in between Memphis and Nashville. And coming from California, that was an adjustment for me. Like going to fast food, I'm thinking like 20 minutes tops. We in out the drive-through, we keep it moving. We spend like down near 45 minutes to an hour in the drive-through, right? And I'm tripping, and everybody looking at me like I'm crazy. But because of me being from California, the pace of things happens so much faster, right? So if you think about California and you think about the North, right? New York, Chicago, Detroit, it's more of a fast-paced place as well, right? So you hear that in Malcolm's speech, right? He's speaking with the pace of what's going on around him, right? This whole idea of a New York minute, right? So this is saying that a minute in New York happens faster than anywhere else in the world. So you have to be attentive to that, and your speech has to echo those sentiments. But in the South, with things being slow, you can slow your speech down. You could use those strategic pauses to allow your audience to reflect on what was just said, right? So the notion, and you hear this in both speeches, right? Both in Malcolm and in Martin's speech, this idea of call and response. Who is familiar, or who has heard of this notion of call and response before? Has anybody? Okay, so for those who haven't, and if you have been to a black church, then you've seen call and response at play, but you may not have known it was called call and response. So if you think about the preacher saying, "Can I get an amen?" and the church says amen, that's a call and response, right? If you take the call and response idea outside of the church, if you go to a concert, the DJ is the incubator of the call and response. Have you ever been to a concert and the DJ drops the music out, and the artist, whoever's performing, they're not singing, they've puts the mic to the crowd, and they're expecting you to sing those lyrics or rap those lyrics, right? That's a call and response. In my classroom, right, my pedagogy is largely based off of call and response, which is why I asked you to open up the camera, because I could feel that call and response, right? So even if you don't say anything and you give me a head nod, I know that I'm engaging with you at a level that we're being connected, right? So a large part of the Black radical tradition, the Black literary tradition, what they call liberation theology, right? So teaching Christianity from a standpoint of liberatory praxis, right, is this notion of engaging with your audience and being connected and tied to your audience, right? And being able to glean strength from your audience by hearing their responses, right? And you hear that both in Malcolm's speech and in Martin's speech. Although the crowd call and response may sound a little different, right? You may not get an amen with Malcolm. You may hear right on, brother, something to that effect, right? But the premise is still the same, right? I think also Kaylin hit it really on the head with the way that she opened up our fishbowl and this notion of collectivity, right? Um, Economically, if we are distinct, if we separate ourselves, right, we're a poor community. And they say in our now, the dollar does not stay within the Black community longer than 24 hours, right? But what Martin is saying is that if we are to bring this collective, this economic power together collectively, that gives us an economic power base. Okay. Um, Anybody familiar with Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma? We may have talked about this in class before, but for those who are not familiar, Caitlin, can you kind of explain to the class what Black Wall Street is, or what it was? Excuse me.
If I'm not mistaken, I don't know the whole details of it, but it was like a place where um it was a time where all these I think it was the wasn't it the 1800s? The 1800s and
1920s.
19.
1920s.
Okay. So it was like all these black people who I forgot. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I forgot.
I'll fill in the details. So 1920s around there. There's this place in Oklahoma. It's called Tulsa. Um, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine were like the major cross streets. My grandmother, my mother's side, is from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So a lot of the stories and the information that I have about Black Wall Street comes from my grandmother, whose her grandmother was a central figure in this town at the time. But the economic wealth in Black Wall Street was astronomical. Financially, they would be able to trade with, they're actually planning to trade with entities outside the United States. So establishing trade routes with places like France and places like in other areas in Europe, right? They had their own banks, they had their own hospitals, they had their own schools, they had their own grocery stores, right? This is a thriving, self-sufficient, economic power-based area, right? Also, keep in mind this is during segregation, so a lot of this was due to necessity. You got sick, you couldn't go to the doctors on the white part of town, so you made sure that your town had doctors, so you built hospitals, right? If you need to be educated, you know that you couldn't receive education on the white side of town, so you made sure that your part of town had schools, right? Banks, they had their own banks, etc. Just to kind of give you an idea of the wealth of Black Wall Street. In the state of Oklahoma, there were 2 airports, right? In the whole state, 2 airports. Within the area of Black Wall Street alone, there were 11 private jets. Wrap your mind around this. 2 airports, right? So California, we have, well, let's say in Southern California and from LA to the IE, right? You have LAX. I know there's an airport in Long Beach, and then it's a very small one in Long Beach. And then we have the Ontario airport, right? So we have 3 airports. In Black Wall Street, there was 11 private jets. Okay, so I don't know if y'all know how expensive it is to have a private jet, not only to store it, but the gas for a private jet alone is ridiculous. Okay, so that's how much wealth that these African people was able to amass, and this was all under the idea of bringing our money, bringing our resources, bringing our wealth together. Right? The individuals in Black Wall Street weren't operating under the premise that, well, long as my family is okay, then we good, right? my grandmother used to always tell me stories about her grandfather, and what he would do is when he got back from hunting, when he got back from shopping, um, my great grandmother would prepare the food, but she would prepare enough food for the entire neighborhood to eat, right? And they would put the food in like these big ass troughs, so where you would just come get your plate, right? So just this idea of not just thinking about me and my family, but thinking about us as a whole, right? And this is what not only Dr. King, but Malcolm X is also speaking about, this notion of collectivity, right? So I think Kalen's musing on this notion of connectiveness and collective actions from an economic and a political standpoint is very on spot on, and you see the profundity, the how profound the thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X was when it's centered around this notion of a collective power base. Um, yeah, and I think also not only Natalia but Nakai also, they talk about the different ways that they use religion, right? Nakai says, Martin Luther King was a little bit more reliant on religion due to his location, right? To where Malcolm X also he's a preacher himself, right? He's a Muslim minister, so he has a very strong religious ties. But his approach is, let me not use my religion as the first thing that I'm going to identify with, because I recognize that that could be divisive, right? So I'm going to put that to the side for now. I'm going to leave my religion in the closet. I'm going to leave my religion at home, and I'm going to focus and organize around this notion of my blackness, right? So two separate approaches on the way to use religion, but the overall goal was the same, and that was freedom and liberty, right? So thank you guys. That was a great fishbowl. We have about a half hour left, and I want to hear some other thoughts that you guys had on the readings. We could discuss what was discussed in the breakout rooms, anything that was mentioned in the fishbowl, or just what you guys thought about the speeches.
Um, I'll go.
Okay.
So something that I I noticed was that Dr. King's speech didn't really like shift my views about him or his work, because I like his work. I like how he addresses his speeches and all of that. But I personally like Malcolm X, because Malcolm X gets straight to the point. He doesn't really sugarcoat anything, and he gets to a lot of different people of a lot of different cultures, which is something that I really like. So I feel like current days, Malcolm X would be more effective, especially with today's youth, because um, we don't really like a lot of like sugarcoating. We like being told like the straight truth and like straight to the point, which is something about our society. We always like getting straight to the point. We don't like extending like speeches and all of that, because we want to hear what is really going on, which is something that I really liked about Malcolm X's speeches. But I also like Dr. King's like sense of unity and bringing in the religious perspective. So that's what I noticed.
You bring up a really good point, Angelica. And I don't know if the rest of the class picked up on this, but I want to kind of spend some time with the point that she raises. So she draws a distinction between their style. Um, Martin Luther King, again, a Southern Baptist minister. So if you think about the Bible, right, a lot of use of metaphors, a lot of use of allegory, a lot of use of stories, right? So that you see that infused in his method, juxtaposed to Malcolm X, who really developed his speech giving style in the jailhouse and then on the soapbox, right? So at the time of Malcolm coming to age and coming to popularity in Harlem, New York, they had the soapbox preachers, right? So all the Christian preachers would stand outside the church on a soapbox. All the Hebrew Israelites would stand outside their location on the soapbox. You have the Nation of Islam would stand outside on their soapbox, and you would just give your speech to the people walking on the street, right? So with that method, you couldn't really give this long, drawn out, exaggerated speech. You had to get to the point because you're literally trying to catch somebody walking past, right? So you had to be very direct. And what Angelica says, being attentive to this distinction, because of the way that our society is so now, right? How many characters do you have limited on Twitter, right? You can only do so many characters, right? So even the way that we begin to receive information in this day and age is limited. Everything is restricted, right? She says that Malcolm would be a lot more effective nowadays because of the directness of his message, right? So I'm curious to know what other people think about that. Another way to think about this question, who would have the most effect in, we'll call this the Black Lives Matter era of activism? Do you think Malcolm's speech and Malcolm's style and what Malcolm is talking about, really, and let's be clear, what they're talking about is really the same thing. The only difference is how they're talking about it, right? So, who do you feel would be more effective in our contemporary, in our now, right? The method of Malcolm or the method of Martin?
I would say Malcolm X because especially because times have passed so much and we've seen how effective the peaceful protest is, and I feel like as a unit we have we've realized that even when we peaceful protest, they still come at us with violence. Nothing changes. So I feel like Malcolm's notion of kind of like revolt more. I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but that would probably go more in today's world.
So I think you're absolutely right, Gabriella. And if you think about history, and because of time, we are not going to be able to get into this because really how I typically situate the course, right? So once we get done with Martin, we'll go into like the Black Panthers, right? And really what the thrust of the Black Panthers is realizing that for the Black Panthers, right? Their parents' way of doing it, it didn't work, right? So while you're singing and you're marching, you're still getting your ass whooped, right? So with them coming to that realization, we have to go about this differently, right? Hence the term, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, right? So just like in the past, you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? You would institute this notion of nonviolence even in the title of your organizations, right? The Black Panthers took this idea and flipped it and said, no, we're going to make an organization built around this notion of self-defense. So if you hit me, I'm hitting your ass back, right? You pull out a gun on me, I'm going to pull out a gun and I'm going to clock a bullet in the chamber just to make sure that you know I ain't playing, right? So, and I think this speaks to what Gabriella is talking about, right? If we're seeing in the whole, well, let me go back. One of the whole methods of the nonviolent movement was dependent on the fact that the opponent, the opposition, right, they have a consciousness and they would realize the grace in you not responding violently to violent acts being enacted upon you, right? So this is how they viewed this premise of nonviolence working, right? There's going to be a moral shift in the oppressor that's going to make them feel compassionate to your position of remaining nonviolent, although you're experiencing violence, right? The only problem with that, and this is what something that Kwame Ture says, they don't have that conscience, that morality that made them feel compassionate to you getting whooped on. It didn't change them to alter their behavior, right? So what Gabriella is saying, I have to kind of agree with in a sense because history has showed us that this by and large did not work, right? But what we don't have in recent history is active actions of rebellion, and to see how those actions of rebellion and self-defense could kind of shift the way that the oppressors and the opposition respond to us. Angelica, why don't you say what you put in the chat, please?
So another point I noticed while reading and during the discussion was that not Malcolm X, MLK was calling for unity through nonviolent protest. And that was because that was his method of going about all of this, while Malcolm X was calling for unity. But he said that if there is a need for violence, that they will do it, which is why the speech is called The Ballad or the Bullet, because you either hear them in the voting booth or you're gonna hear them through like guns or violence. And Malcolm X believed that nonviolent methods aren't effective for noticeable progress. Um, he believed that like violence would be a way to be heard immediately.
Yeah, very good point. Kaylin, did you want to speak on what you put in the chat? You bring up a really good point.
I was saying that I guess both of them in a way will be acceptable depending on who you're talking to. For instance, for politicians and people who don't want to see people become violent and take extreme measures, they'll lean towards MLK because they want peace and slow progression and all that stuff. But Malcolm X, however, he's more of the change, like right here, right now, by any means necessary. We'll take every precaution, stuff like that, if it's needed. So that might fall into like, I wouldn't say extremist because we never been too extreme, but black people, I mean people in general who want to see change like fast, like now we need want it now and stuff like that. So
Yeah, and I think also what I'm hearing implicitly in your conversation and your musings is that really Martin's method and his approach is easily manipulated by the powers that be, right? The state can say, you know what, well, we need to listen to this guy Martin Luther King here because he's doing it the right way, right? This is the way that you should express your grievances. And in doing so, they could continue these systems of oppression for another 5 years, right? To whereas Malcolm was like, nah, homie, this is changing today, right? Um, and I think that's why Martin Luther King holds a certain place in history, right? That we have Martin Luther King Day, right? It's a national holiday. They're not having no Malcolm X Day, right? And I think that's due to what Caitlin is kind of touching on in the sense that because of Martin Luther King's nonviolence, he's deemed as respectable. And this is also why you don't get into a lot of the speeches in the latter part of his life, because not to say he moves from this nonviolence position, but his critique gets a little bit more robust. Yes, the good Negro. Yep, absolutely, absolutely. What are some other thoughts on the readings or the speech? Excuse me. Also curious to hear. I know Angelica said, I believe it was Angelica said she didn't really shift her thinking on Martin Luther King's work too much. But I'm curious to hear. Is there anybody whose view of Martin Luther King kind of shifted from hearing this speech?
I did just want to add on real quick, even though it's not the to the question, but I did want to say how Martin Luther King, like he was the digestible black man, the digestible like leader because he was nonviolent, but it's crazy because they still killed him. So I'm like, they're mad if we do and they're mad if we don't. It's not really, but yeah.
And it's funny because the same state apparatus that touts him and holds him up and props him up for MLK and his nonviolence are the same state apparatus that made sure that that bullet got through, right? So that's a very, very good point, Gabriella. Other thoughts, other comments, other concerns? Jack, what did you think about the speech? Jack, we waiting on you, man.
Oh, I thought that was pretty empowering in the sense that but in the sense that MLK he like his ideals and
His ideas were empowering.
yes.
So if we're going to use this word empowerment, right? So typically when I think about empowerment, it's something that causes you to act as well, right? So if I'm as your professor, I'm empowering you guys to think critically, right? So I'm going to give you the tools to help you understand what's going on in this world, so you can be critical as to what's happening. So if you're going to use the term empowerment for the speech, which I agree with, Jack. How were you particularly empowered by this? What were you felt inclined or provoked to do from hearing this speech?
Basically, what I felt like from this speech is that like there's a sense of things that we as humans, like we still have our issues with each other, and and how we just can't seem to get along. And basically what I'm open my eyes to is well not well yeah open my eyes is that um hold on, I lost my train of thought.
You good? You're talking about the inability of humanity to get along, right? That's
Yes.
a good point.
The- and based on what's been going on for the past year and throughout our history, it really shows that yeah we there's still a lot of, even though he cut through the tip of the iceberg, there's still a lot of things that we, as us, young people, or anyone, like we still have our role to do.
Yeah. And for me, that's why glissant is so important, because especially the text that we read, and not just the chapter that we read, the open boat, but that whole book, right? The poetics of relation. He's really thinking about how people relate, right? And he's saying that we, as a society, need to be more attentive to how we relate to one another. If we think back to the start of the semester, reading the Ma'at readings, reading the teachings of Ptah, right? These are also readings about societal relations. How do we get along with one another, right? And you could talk about politics and legislation and things of that nature, but at the bare level, right? At the quotidian, at the everyday level, how do I treat you when I see you, right? That's really what matters. And that's really what's going to change the way that society is operating, right? So being hyper attentive to this idea and this notion of relation. So I think you bring up a very good point, Jack. Let's hear some other thoughts. Who else has a affective response from what you heard? Alex, what were your thoughts on the speech?
I thought it was very impactful on like what he was saying and stuff.
Okay, so give me a little bit more than that. What part in particular impacted you?
Just like how who is it? Kayleen saying like how Martin Luther King was like basically saying the same stuff, but like they ended up killing him for like basically almost the same thing that they were like what he was saying for his speech and stuff.
Right. So, and I believe it was Gabriella who was saying that, although one took a nonviolent stance, one was more comfortable with violence, the end result was the same, right? So
Yeah,
we know that the state is going to respond violently, regardless of your stance on violence or nonviolence.
yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was gonna share something regarding Malcolm X. I actually I like I like that I got to the opportunity to hear his speech, because I didn't like I had heard about him, and I think that even though like I did hear good about him, I think most of it was kind of like they were kind of
Mm-hmm.
negative comments, I guess. I think just because like he I guess supported well, I don't want to say he supported violence, but you know how that was kind of like his what do you call it? Well, like like he took on that I don't know what the word is, but like like he was ready to defend himself, like not only himself but as a community. So I think it wasn't like I just got to learn more about him, and I saw that it's not necessarily that he was like a violent person, but he was like he was for defending like themselves as a community. Like he saw that by just talking, like, well, not much was getting done, and basically like he was just ready to take other measures if necessary to gain freedom, and like to just like gain that for his community.
You know, Natalia, what I appreciate most about what you just said is how you said it and how measured you were on placing claims on Malcolm. Like you started to say something, you kind of
Yeah.
scaled it back and looked for the right word. And I think that's important because you're absolutely right. We've come to understand Malcolm through a trope, right? And we've come to understand the relationships between Malcolm and Martin through this trope of separation, right? The violent one, the non-violent one, the respectable one, the non-respectable one, right? And what's important to understand, fundamentally, Malcolm never did anything violent. He is not on record doing anything violent ever. But what he does say, right? If somebody put their hands on you, wipe them off the planet, right? So she's right in the sense that he was willing to take any measures that is possible to make sure that we obtain our freedom. And that was the ultimate driving force for Malcolm, right? Is how do we obtain our freedom as fast as possible, right? Um, he's not willing to wait 7 years like the project of apartheid in South Africa, right? So in South Africa, they have what's called 7 years of reconciliation, right? So are you guys familiar with the apartheid state in South Africa? Like you had essentially how we had segregation here. They had apartheid in South Africa. Once Nelson Mandela kind of helped initiate the liberation of the apartheid state, what South African government said, well, we'll do these things, but we need 7 years to kind of sort out how we're going to go about doing these things, right? 7 years turned into 14, right? So Malcolm is not with that program. We need something to be done and to be done now, right? And I think that's what Natalia's picking up on, and she's right. Go ahead, Caitlin, say that. What you said in the chat, please.
I said that if no one read it, I said I feel like we are comfortable with the society that's operating right now. Not saying that we're okay with what's going on. I'm saying that I think that like let me give an example. When a person, I'll just say a black person in particular, when they um come to a lot of money, they don't stay in the neighborhood that they lived in. They go to the white neighborhood in the mansions and all that stuff, the safe neighborhoods, and they put their children not in public school with a lot of black kids. They go to the private schools where all the white kids are to get the better opportunities. I don't think that we're ready to make extreme measures to where we can possibly create that for ourselves. Good neighborhoods for ourselves, good schools, good just businesses all around. We have settled to have what we settled for a piece of what white people have. Um like we can see all these people who came from the hood and all that stuff, these rappers, and say they came from the hood, but now they're wearing Gucci and putting all their money and stuff on that side of the, on that side, and not even investing in the neighborhoods. And even if they do come to the neighborhoods, they're present there to recruit. They're trying to get people to uproot from there and move to these white neighborhoods and promote what they got and all that stuff. We're not ready to put our money into our communities and our stuff. it's kind of like it's the success story that we have. We come up, we move out of our neighborhoods instead of putting our money and investing in our people, and we try to, I don't know. We do what they do, and we keep silent about it. We don't even complain anymore. It's like they made us sign some type of, uh, they, in a way, signed away our freedom.
Yeah, through
So
success. Yeah, that's a very good point. And for me, I see the evidence of that in this past election, right? The goal came, and not just for black folks, this is for America, period, right? The goal went from, or the conversation went from freedom, equality, justice, liberty to just getting Trump out the office, right? And if I could take this conversation and kind of focus it on the black community, I even seen memes that were, and one thing about the black community, we gonna joke about anything. It could be the worst shit going on in the world. We gonna find a way to make that shit funny. So I take this with a grain of salt, but there's still another thing when it comes to our jokes. There's always truth hidden behind the jokes that we tell. That's why Richard Pryor and Dave Chappelle are so funny, because they're dealing with a certain element of truth. But I was seeing memes that would say, well, Trump's gone, now let's get back to normal racism, right? And although that was said in a joking manner, folks behaved in that very same fashion, right? Oh, things are cool now, right? I don't feel comfortable with Biden being able to advocate for my safety as a black man, right? He'll give me a good speech, right? But I haven't heard any legislation being passed about the numerous and infinite killing of black men and black women by the police, right? There's no legislation being passed about that. But and I'm gonna say this, I'm gonna clarify. So hear me out totally, okay? Before y'all jump to conclusions about what I'm about to say. Within a matter of months, legislation was passed against anti-Asian crimes, hate crimes. Now, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be passed. You damn sure should pass that type of legislation. But how is it that you cannot pass legislation about the infinite anti-blackness that we've been experiencing since the time that we set foot on this country, right? So again, help me understand or help me reconcile that contradiction, right? Because really, this whole conversation around anti-Asian hate has really picked up within the past year due to COVID. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? So this has been a year of organizing around that. And really for me, I could be wrong, but for me, I've only heard this really pick up within the past 6 months, okay? So we could say within a year, they got legislation on the books for the Asian community, right? We've been here on paper, right, through the enslavement experience since 1619. Since 1619. We're in 2021, and there has still yet to be any legislation that stops the disembodiment of the black body, right? That stops the murder of the black body, right? They're talking about ending qualified immunity. That's still in conversation. It hasn't been passed yet, right? They just now classified, when y'all was in your breakout rooms, I got an alert saying that the 3 individuals who murdered Ahmaud Arbery are being classified for hate crimes, right? That's rare. That's extremely rare that anyone gets classified for a hate crime when it's dealing with black folks, right? So again, from a legislative standpoint, there's a vast disconnect between how we are able to afford legal recourse and how certain other communities are afforded the legal recourse. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Gabriella. Right, since 2012, right? 2012, and we're still dealing with the same shit. Yes, I'm just looking at what Caitlin's saying in the chat, and then also a thing that community has, and it's vastly unfair to them, and it creates this division. Right? Is this notion of the model minority? Has anybody heard of this idea of the model minority? What does that mean? The model minority.
I think it's the notion that like Asians um how they're just more valuable. They're known to be doctors and dentists, and they're like that's expected upon them, I think.
Yep. And right on top of that, they're quiet about their suffering, right? They and like I'm not saying that because within the past year you hear about it more. It doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, right? But the way that they experience it, they don't do make the big fuss, right? And that's what gives them this moniker of the model minority, right? And again, this is the state playing on them, right? This is a manipulation by the state. It's another divisive tactic, right? So, and what I'm saying is not a critique on their community, it's a critique on the state, right? Because they aren't passing the legislation, they're advocating for the legislation to be passed. And they got what they wanted, as they should, right? That's not the problem. The problem is, why can't black folks get that legislation as well, right? So that's why I'm gonna be absolutely clear so y'all know, yo, Professor Mary's talking shit about the 8 and 9. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying that the state, the government apparatus is unequal in how they distribute who can receive legal recourse, right? So we're at 3 o'clock. I want to show you guys something real quick as it pertains to this division that you hear between Malcolm and Martin, and then we'll call it a day. And I want to show you guys. I'll show this to you real quick. So this is a telegram that Malcolm X sent to Martin Luther King back in 1964. This is right before Martin was assassinated, a little bit before that. And in the telegram, he says, "Dear Martin Luther King, St. Augustine, Florida, we have been witnessing with great concern the vicious attacks of the white races against our defenseless people there in St. Augustine. If the federal government will not send troops to your aid, just say the word, and we will immediately dispatch some of our brothers there to organize self-defense units among our peoples, and the Ku Klux Klan will then receive a taste of its own medicine. The day of turning the other cheek to those brute beasts is over," right? And I just want to let you guys see that so you don't have to fall into this trope of the beef between Malcolm and Martin, right? As they come to the end of their lives and the end of their careers, they were very much lock and key in the way that they perceive things. And you see from the evidence that I just showed you, right? Malcolm did a full 180 in his position, and he was even willing to send self-defense units down to defend Martin Luther King and the work that he was doing. So we'll call it a break there.